Yep. Good morning, everyone. So, last session we discussed about how do we use custom events. Now, today we will see a very major important concept, that is component life cycle hooks. The component life cycle hooks. This is very important with regard to interviews. That means in interviews, lot of questions are asked related to this topic. So at any level, either it is experience level or fresher level, so many questions are asked here. That means 50% of your Angular interview you can handle if you are good in this topic, if you are aware of this concept, right? So 50% majority concepts under this life cycle hooks on. Let's see what it is actually. First, we discussed about component. Life cycle hooks means the question is how a component works from the begin to end. What is the basic flow? For that, first, we need to understand, before going into component lifecycle flow, we need to understand the Angular request flow first. We need to understand the Angular request flow. Request flow means how the process happens from client side and server side. A high level design for that. Actually, how the request flow happens is here. This is yep. So generally the client, this is the client computer, that is the client, or we say user. So this is the client, and we have an Angular application. So this is the client, and we are having an Angular application. This is our Angular application. This is Angular application, Angular app. Now, generally how this is going to work is, in our application, we have some components, like we have a login component, some register component, some home component. Like this, we have some components. Now, for whatever components you are having in your application, what Angular will do is, Angular is going to prepare, every Angular application is going to prepare a table for this. Every Angular application prepares a table. We call this as a routing table. Every Angular application have a routing table. This routing table contains information about what are the resources which can be delivered to client. That means what we can deliver to client when any client makes a request. That information is kept inside this routing table. That means all the requests are defined here. For example, This table contains information about how the request path, that means it contains the path and it contains component. Lot of other details also present in this. Path means so / login. Then which component to access, login component. If it is home, which component to access home, like this. That means for every Angular application, there will be a table. We call this as a routing table. This routing table contains information about the responses that an Angular application can give. That means now what are the requests expected, like login, like home, like register. These are the requests. So this is managed by a routing table. Now in the next level, you are going to see this table. In the next level, you are going to create this table. Till now, we haven't designed this table and we don't know this table. Later, we are going to create this table, routing table. Now, when first client makes a request, this request actually comes. This request, how the client makes request, we know. That means the path is like this. http://localhost 4200 and the request will be to / some login / some login. The client request will be in this way. So let's keep this here. Yeah, the client request will be in this way. This is how the client makes a request. When he makes a request, this request will come to a computer. Actually, this request will come to a web server. We call it as web server. This web server is also known as HTTP server. HTTP server. This is the web server. Client request comes to this web server. In this web server, actually, this web server contains a HTTP processing pipeline. It contains a HTTP processing pipeline. HTTP processing pipeline. It contains a HTTP processing pipeline. The web server contains a processing pipeline. It contains a processing pipeline. That is the location where all the processes happen. When you make a request, that means this is what request. This is a request from the client. This request will be processed in web server. In web server, where it will be processed in the processing pipeline. Once it is processed in the processing pipeline, who will process that in the processing pipeline? In the processing pipeline, this will be processed by a handler. We call it as HTTP handler. It is actually processed by HTTP handler. HTTP handler is responsible for handling the request from the client and process that request. In every web application, whenever you make a request, that request will come to web server. In the web server, there will be a processing pipeline. All the process is managed in the processing pipeline. Who will manage a handler? The handler name is HTTP handler. This HTTP handler is responsible for managing request and response. What this handler will do is, whatever the request you made, it will give that request to an engine. It will give the request to an engine. We call this as a routing engine. Routing engine. The request is given to a routing engine. What this routing engine will do is, that means the handler is going to give that to the routing engine. It is going to give this to the routing engine. This is the routing engine. What routing engine will do is, it will verify from the route table, is that requested path available or not. That means, what is the path requested? Login. So this request will come to the handler. Handler will send to routing engine. Routing engine will verify in the route table, is that request available or not. If the request is not available, then this routing engine will return the status code like 404, means 404 means not found. 200 means okay. Right? These are the request codes it will send. If the requested path is not available, then what will happen? It will send a status code 404. 404 means whatever you requested is not available. From where it is verifying whether available or not? It is verifying from routing table. Routing table. Once it is available, then a routing table identifies which component is required. Which component is required? Login. Then what routing table will do is, it will load that login component into Angular application. That means the login component is loaded into Angular application. After the login component is loaded into Angular application, it will deliver the output to the routing engine. It will take to the handler. Handler will send that as a response to the client. That means whatever the client requests, for that it will send a response. It sends response to client. It sends the response to client. It will send that response to client. This is the basic flow. I will give this in the classroom. I will save this. This is request flow. So the basic request flow. Yeah. So this is request flow. Okay. This is the basic request flow, how it actually works. So every Angular application comprises of components. What are all the components available? How they can be requested? That information is present in where? What are the components available and what components can be delivered? So that information is present in routing table. Routing table is a virtual table which contains all the information about the requests that your Angular application can manage. Whenever client makes a request, first the request will come to web server. Web server will process the request in the processing pipeline by using a handler, HTTP handler. Actually, up to this, every technology is same. Java, .NET, PHP, Python, every web technology up to this same. You make a request, it is given to web server. In the web server processing pipeline, actually web server have lot of things. In that processing pipeline, I am not going in depth about web server, that you will learn in server side technologies. If you are learning any server side technologies, you will understand what happens inside web server. Right? Here, generally, the processing pipeline takes help of handler and gets the request. It will give the request to a routing engine. So every Angular application takes help of a routing engine. And actually this routing engine process your request by comparing with the route table. It will verify in the route table whether requested path is available or not. If it is not available, it will send a message not found. If it is available, then it will load that component in your application. Now the question is, component is loaded, how much time it will be there? Component is loaded and memory is allocated for this component. Component is loaded and memory allocated for login. How much time this component will be in the memory until the next component is requested. Once you request another component, this component is destroyed and another component is loaded. Remember, this component is destroyed and another component is loaded. That means whatever memory allocated for login is removed and new memory is allocated for another component which is requested. So what is the lifespan of a component? The lifespan of a component from the time you requested to the time until the next component is requested, or from the time you requested until the time application is running. You are not requesting any another component and close application, automatically this component is destroyed. So the lifespan of a component is from request to another request of component. So that is the lifespan of every component. And remember, memory is completely cleaned up once a component is gone. This is a biggest drawback in all web technologies. I hope you already learned that, you already know in web designing that HTTP is a stateless protocol. You heard about that? HTTP is a stateless protocol. Any web technology will tell you this point first. HTTP is a stateless protocol. You are using any web application which is using HTTP or HTTPS. They are stateless protocols. Stateless protocol means they make a request. After making the request, process the request. Until the request is processed, memory is allocated. Once the request is finished, the memory is deleted. And this memory is not available to the next request. Then the challenge for web developer is how to carry data from one request to another. Because HTTP's nature is, it deletes the memory after every request. That is why we call it as stateless protocol. HTTP is a stateless protocol. How do you manage this? That is the reason your technologies server side, they will teach you state management techniques. State management techniques, Java, .NET, PHP, Python. Everywhere web development, you will learn state management techniques. What these state management techniques will teach you, how to store the data and keep the data available across requests. Without state management, there is no web application. So there is no web application without state management. That means we need to carry data from one component to another. For that, we need to manage memory, right? Here, this is the first phase. So in this phase, what is the Angular request flow? In that first point, client makes a request to Angular application. Client makes a request to Angular application on web server. Makes a request to Angular application on web server. The request will be like this: http://localhost 4200/ some login. Next point, request is processed in web server. Request is processed in web server by HTTP handler. Within the processing pipeline. So the request is processed in the web server by HTTP handler within the processing pipeline. After that, handler uses a routing engine. Handler uses a routing engine. What this routing engine will do is, it uses a routing engine which maps to the route table in application. What it will do is, routing engine verifies the requested URL path with the path configured in route table. If requested path is not matching with route path, then it returns 404 status. 404 status means, in web technologies, what it means: not found. It is not found. Now, if requested path is found, then it loads the requested component into memory. If the requested path is found, then it loads the requested component into memory. Once the component is loaded into memory, so that means the component life cycle is initiated. Now the component life cycle starts. In this life cycle, there are various phases. That means the component life cycle comprises of various phases from initialization to destroying. Component lifecycle comprises of various phases from initialization to destroying. From initialization to destroying, lot of phases will be there. Those phases are called the life cycle the life cycle phases. Phases are managed. Life cycle phases are managed by a set of methods known as life cycle hooks. The entire component life cycle is managed by a set of methods. Those methods are called as life cycle hooks. Why they are called life cycle hooks? Because these methods automatically hook the another method once the first method is finished. That means they hook another method and executes it in a sequential order. The methods are hooked. Hooked means they are invoked automatically one after another. So they process one after another. They process one after another. So component life cycle is that. Component life cycle means, so from the time you requested the component, so till the component is in the memory, it will undergo various phases. It will undergo various phases. These phases are called life cycle hooks, right? So let's see one more time here what is the concept is. We made a request to the application. That request will come to web server. Web server process the request in the pipeline with the help of a handler. And it will give that request to routing engine. Routing engine maps to route table and verifies whether the requested path is available or not. If the requested path is not found, then it returns 404. If the requested path is found, then it loads the component into the memory. Once the component is loaded into memory, then the component life cycle starts. In the component life cycle, there are various phases. These phases are managed by some methods. And these methods are called as life cycle hooks, right? So component life cycle hooks means component life cycle methods. Why these life cycle methods are required? They are required to handle various phases of component. What are those phases? We will see now. That is the important part here. What are the phases? How they actually work? We need to know that. I hope up to this you are clear, right? Basic, right? That means how the flow works, how the request happens, and how the response will go, right? Now we need to understand what happens in this area. That means we need to understand what happens here from the time it initiated, from the time it is destroyed, what happens. So actually the second thing you need to know, so this is the request flow. After the request flow, second you have to know life cycle phases. Life cycle phases. As I already told you, the component life cycle phases are managed by different methods. They are managed by different methods. And remember, these methods will be working in the background, even you don't know about them. That means you even don't know the method names. In the background, they will be working. Even you don't write these methods, in the background, they will be working. Just like we have a class. In a class, there is a special method called constructor. If I don't create any constructor, will be a constructor inside class, right? That means you are not creating any constructor. Then by default, there will be a constructor in every class. What is the role of that constructor? The role of that constructor is creating object, instantiation, right? Then why you are writing a constructor? If already a constructor is there, why you are writing another again constructor? If already constructor is there, why you are writing a constructor again? Because constructor is already doing some work internally, right? In addition to that work, you want some more work to be done at the time of instantiation. Then we write a constructor. Why to write a constructor if already constructor is there? Because constructor is already doing some functionality. And along with that functionality, you want some more work to be done. Then you can write a constructor. Similarly, these life cycle methods also. Every component have life cycle methods. These methods will be working in the background. Even you don't write, they will be working in the background. Then why to write these methods? We have to write the methods sometimes. Why to write the methods? Because already they are doing some work. In addition to that, we want some more work to be done. Then what we do? We write these life cycle methods manually and give the additional task there. For example, every component destroys. If every component destroys, why a developer have to manually write destroy method? We can write destroy method. Why we have to write destroy method? Because Angular component is destroying. The memory allocated for component is destroyed. But for that component, an explicit memory is used. Explicit memory means which is outside the component. That memory is not destroyed. Component is destroyed, but the explicit memory is not destroyed. Then what we have to do? Manually, we have to destroy that memory. That means at the time of destroying, whatever it is doing is not enough. We want some more extra work to perform. Then we write that method. For example, you see, you are closing a browser. When you close a browser, your account is not signed out. Browser is closed. Your account is not signed out. You again open the browser and open that website. Directly you will log in. That means some memory is managed outside the context, which we have to manually delete. So such additional activities we have to write manually by using these life cycle phases. So life cycle phases are nothing but, that means these are a set of phases. So these are a set of phases that occur in a sequential order. So life cycle of component starts when component is requested. Life cycle component starts when component is requested. And life cycle of component ends when another component is requested, or the application is closed. Life cycle of component starts when the component is requested, and the life cycle ends when the component is, there is no concept of component closing. You cannot close any component. You request another component, this component will be gone. Right? There is no concept of closing a component. So this component is removed only when the next component is there. Or you close the application. You close the application. So these are, that means from component requested to another component requested or the application closed, the life cycle will be there. Life cycle will be there. So these phases are managed by a set of methods. These are managed by a set of methods. What are those methods? Let's see. The first important phase one. The first phase. The life cycle methods, there are so many life cycle methods. So the first phase one is called, this phase one is managed by, phase one is managed by, we'll give a point here. It is managed by ng on changes. It is managed by ng on changes. The phase one, first phase is managed by ng on changes. So what is the first phase of Angular component life cycle? The first phase of Angular component life cycle is ng on changes. There are so many life cycle hook methods. Actually, these are the life cycle hook methods. ng on changes, ng on init, ng do check, content init, after content init, after view init, after view checked, and ng on destroy. These are the major component lifecycle related phases, which we are going to discuss one by one. What is detail about these phases, right? Remember, the first phase is ng on changes. ng on changes. Now, what happens here? Let's see. So it is managed, first phase is managed by ng on changes. Actually, what happens here is, so initialization of references are managed in this phase. Initialization of references are managed in this phase. That means you created some references for storing data. Those references are initialized by ng on changes. Initialization of references are managed in this phase. For example, public, suppose name is a string type is equal to John. I written like this. Now this is the value stored in name. Now I am not changing any value. By default, what is the value assigned? Name. Now if I show this line and ask, is there any change happening in this line? Is there any change happening in this line? Is there any change happening in this line? Means, is any value change happening in this line? Is there any value change happening in this line? We are initializing John into name. Is there any change happening? Change is happening. Change is happening. What is the change is? Actually, public name string, it is allocated into memory. When it is allocated into memory, it is actually undefined. It is actually undefined. After undefined, this John value is stored inside it. That means, remember, this is assigning this value, na? Am I right? Assigning that value. Before assigning, what was it? That means there will be a phase before that assignment, initialization, right? That means before this value is sent into name, what was the name having? Name is having undefined. That means empty. So this undefined is replaced with a word called John. That means here also change is happening. This is where many people fail in their answers in general interviews. If you show this line, they say, what change is happening? Nothing. There is a John value, it is a value. What is change here? Actually, there is change because at the time component created, name was undefined. After the component is created, this initialization is nothing but assigning a value into undefined. That means it is storing this value into name. Before storing, what was it? Directly name don't have value. It is undefined. Into undefined, this value is supplied. That is the reason initialization also comes under change detection. This is called change detection. Change detection means some changes occurred. Some changes occurred. That means initialization of references are managed in this phase. Initialization means what? Sending some value into name. Sending this value into name. That is one point. Another one is binding the value. Binding the value to UI is also managed in this phase. That means storing value into a reference, collecting that value and binding to UI. How you bind the value to UI? Suppose there is a div or there is a text box. Into this text box, how to bind this value? To bind the value, we use property binding. Property binding, value is equal to, what is it? Name. That means storing a value in a reference, collecting the value from the reference and attaching to a element in UI. This is also under which phase? Phase 1. Under which phase? NG on changes. NG on changes manages initialization. And what do you call this as? We call this as property binding now. We call this as property binding. That means initialization, property binding, attribute binding, property binding or attribute binding or interpolation. All these will happen. All these will happen in which phase? They will happen in a phase called NG on changes. NG on changes is the first phase. Many times people think in a wrong way. They think there is NG on in it. They think initialization is first phase. No. Before the initialization, first phase is NG on changes. NG on changes is the first phase. In this phase, values are initialized. These values are binded to UI. After that, another point is it identifies the changes. It identifies the changes in UI. It identifies the changes in UI and updates to reference. What is this called as? It identifies the changes in the UI. That means you binded value to UI. It identifies the changes in UI and updates back. What is this called as? Two-way binding now. We call this method as two-way binding. That means data binding is also managed in which phase? ng on changes. One-way binding, two-way binding. And tell me here how identifies, how the changes are identified and updated back. To identify the changes and to update back, we use ng model. What ng model will use to identify changes? What ng model uses to identify the changes? What ng model uses to identify changes? It uses a event binding technique. It uses a event binding technique on change, on blur. We use ng model in a parenthesis. Na? That means, what is that parenthesis? Event binding. That means, so custom, this is Angular events, Angular built-in events, Angular built-in events are managed in this phase. That means click, change, blur, focus, key up, mouse over, all such events, built-in events are managed in this phase only. So lot of things are happening. That means almost everything happening here. That means values are initialized into memory. Those values are binded to UI. Identifies the changes in the UI. Update back those changes to the reference. All this activity is done in ng on changes. ng on changes. Not only that, that means built-in events, on click, on change, on blur, all these built-in events. Built-in events means like click, like key up, like mouse over, all these things will happen here. Identifying the changes, updating the changes back. That means here another point, that means actually this is managed. So ng model manages data binding. Na? ng model manages data binding. So that ng model is going to handle the data binding. That is also in which phase? That is also in ng on changes. ng on changes. It is going to manage everything in this phase. So a lot of things are happening here. So I hope you are clear. For example, if I write like this, suppose I write like this. So public, some name is a string. Like this I define. And public price is a number. Suppose price is a number, and in that some value is stored. Now in these two, which one is change detection? Second one is change detection. First one is no change detected. Why no change detected? Because at the time of allocating memory, it is undefined, and now also it is undefined. But what happened to the second one? At the time of allocating memory, it was undefined. Later, some value is initialized. That means change detected. That means in these two lines where change is detected. The second line, change detected. Change detected. That means here the change detection happened. Change detected. Change detected. How the change is detected? Actually, a technique is used. That I will tell you. Who identifies the changes, right? Actually, these changes are identified by simple changes object. These changes are identified by simple changes object. There will be an object called simple changes. It will identify the changes. How it will identify the changes? This object contains two properties, previous value and current value. It will contain previous value and current value. By verifying these two, if previous value is equal to current value, then no change detected. Already I explained in NG model. So if previous value is matching with current value, no change detected. Previous value is not equal to current value, then change detected. This is managed by an object called simple changes. This object is provided by a method ng on changes. ng on changes provides a object called simple changes. Simple changes. So here one more point is that. So first thing, initialization, property binding, event binding, data binding. One more option is there. So styles and classes are also binded in this phase. Styles and classes are also binded in this phase. If any element is having CSS and styles, inline styles or other styles, those also binded to UI in this phase. That means finally, what are the activities done in this phase? So initialization, am I right? Initialization, another one property binding, another one data binding, another one event binding, another one class binding, another one style binding. So all these happens, property binding, or you can say attribute binding, or you can say interpolation, all these activities happens in which phase? ng on changes. So lot of activities are managed in this phase. So all the above techniques, all the above techniques are referred as change detection. They are all referred as change detection. That means, what is angular change detection? Angular change detection is initialization, property binding, attribute binding, interpolation, data binding, event binding, class binding, style binding. All these comes under which one? Change detection. Now interviewer may ask in wide variety of ways. He may ask, angular events will be in which phase? Angular events will be in which phase? In which phase angular events will fire up? Angular events, then you should ask, is it built-in event or custom event? Because custom event will not fire up here. Custom events will not fire up here. Only the built-in events will fire up here. Only built-in events like click, like change, like key up, only built-in events will work here. Custom events not here. Event binding, but which events? Not custom events. Understood? Not custom events. So he may ask in different ways, like data binding happens in which phase? On changes, right? Property binding happens in which phase? On changes. ng model works in which phase? On change. And very important is who identifies the changes. Who identifies the changes? So this is very, very important. So the changes are identified by simple changes object. simple changes object. The changes are identified by simple changes object. How it will identify the simple changes object? So it uses previous value and current value by using previous and current value. This I will show you with an example. We will see, right, how this change detection happens. That means I will show you a simple approach to understand the simple changes, how the simple changes happens. Let's see one point here further. All this under which phase? First phase, phase 1, right? So let's see one example for this here to understand. Every phase you can't see example, right? Because they are internally managed. We need to know them, right? Here, let's create one example for that. So I will give here. Yeah. So I will give two components we need actually for this. Open in integrated terminal ng generate component. This is I will give a name as, so take input, or say here we say, yeah, already we have parent and child, right? I'll say here ng generate component input demo. Okay. I am creating a component input demo and another component is output demo. These are the two components we are having. Input demo and output demo, two options are there, right? Two components are there. Let's keep output demo in the startup. I am giving here output demo. That output demo is in the start. Now I will give this input demo in the startup. Input demo in the startup. Okay, and here app module input demo. Input demo is in the start. ng serve project shopping. So this input demo is in the startup. Okay. Now let's see here. Localhost (4200) input demo works. Let's go to input demo and here we will define div class container fluid. Here you say your name. So text box input type is equal to text. So this is a text box. That is your name. Whatever name entered, that name must be displayed. That means that name must be displayed. I will keep here another div. Another one. Here we want to display. This is output component. Here we need to display the output. That means we have app output demo component is here. That means now what we want to do is whatever value they entered in this component, we want to carry and display here. That means we need to transport data from the parent to child. That's the basic concept, right? Now what we have to do, So we need to have a property here which can collect the value. So we will go to output demo. In output demo component, we need to create an property input. We need to declare a property. So public username. This username is a string, and username is actually string, or so it is undefined. It is string or undefined. That is means it is not having any value. And this username must be displayed in the output here in HTML. Here we will display in a paragraph. Suppose we are saying hello, and what is it? User name, whatever username is there. That means it is currently empty. Now whatever value entered inside this, it must be displayed there. It must be displayed. So what we have to do, when user is typing inside this input demo, when user is typing in text box, what we will do is here for the text box input demo HTML TS, here we will create a property. What is it? Public. Here also we define uname, right? Uname is username. It is a string type, and it is initially what? Undefined. Now I will bind this uname to this text box using two-way binding technique. What is it? Ng model is equal to what? Uname. We are binding that. So what is it? Uname, like this we are defining. That is the uname we configured. All right, we are binding that here. This must be transported into this location. So there is a property. What is the property? Username. But it is not accessible here because we have to mark it as what? Input. When you mark as input, here we can send. What is it? Username is equal to uname. We are typing that. Now, whenever user enters anything, it will get that and display. That is same already we done in several examples. We are collecting the data and displaying in another component. We are transporting data from one component to another. Okay. Now, what we will do is here in this output demo, here we will try to identify the change detection. We will try to track the change detection, right? For that, what I will do is I am not using ng on in it. You see, current our component is implementing which phase? On initialization phase. Now, what is the first phase? Ng on changes. We have to use on changes phase. And on changes is an interface. Interface means you need to implement some mandatory methods. What is the mandatory method? We have to write ng on changes method. You see, it is already having a simple changes object. Ng on changes is having which object? Simple changes object. What this simple changes object can do is, that means it is compulsory if you are using on changes to implement ng on changes method. This method is using simple changes object. This simple changes object internally can verify any change detected or not. I will show you. We will write a simple for loop for where property in changes. We are reading every property of changes object because changes is a simple changes object type. Na? To read all the properties, we are using property. We will use change is equal to changes of property. Every property value we are storing in change. every property value we are storing in change so that you can access previous value, current value. That means what is previous value, what is current value, we can access that information. So we will declare two properties, public, one is previous value, previous value. Previous value is any type. Another one public. So current value is also what type? Any. We are using this previous value, current value. We will collect that here. This dot previous value is equal to change dot we have previous value. That means what is the previous value our component identified, that will be stored in this. And this dot current value is equal to change dot current value. Now we will write a simple logic here, right? This is done. We will put one more message. So public, we will put MSG. MSG is also any type. And here we will keep a simple option. Condition we will write here. What is the condition is, so here we will write a condition. If a previous value, that means this dot, what is it? Previous value is matching with this dot, what is it? Current value. If it is matching with previous value, is matching with current value, this dot MSG, in that we will put a message, no change detected. No change detected. We define that. Else what happens? So this dot MSG, we will put an option, change detected. Change detected. This is just to understand the phases. This is understand the phases. We are defining this. That means change is detected. This message we will put here. Observe carefully in the UI. Here we will put a heading, changes details. We will put here. Let's put here. First we will put a message to make you understand. Here I will put here message. MSG, the message we are displaying. And you can see no change detected. No change detected. There is no change detected. And when I click here and I start typing something, now change is detected. That means it shows the message change detected. Let's do one more work here. Actually, so refresh, this is no change detected. I will go to this input demo, and here the name is undefined. Uname is undefined. What I will do is, this uname I will give as John. Like this I define. Now what happened? It is initialization. Initialization, and it says change detected. Change detected. What change I am doing? I am not doing any change. Then why it is saying change detected? I am not doing any change here. Then why it is saying change detected? Actually, it should be done when I do some change, na? Right? Without doing any change, why it is saying change detected? That means you got the first point, right? That means why it is saying change detected even I don't do any change. Because initializing a value into a reference is also considered as change detection. Because before initialization, what was the value? If you want to see that, let's do one more work here. What I will do in the output, I am displaying here change details. Change details, we will put that here. Data list, data term. So I say previous value. Previous value. Previous value, data definition. Here we will put previous value. Previous value. We are using previous value. Another data term, this is what? Current value. Current value. And we will display the current value. and current value. Okay, now we will do one more here. Here we will write a condition. If previous value is equal to undefined, if it is undefined, then print the word undefined. Undefined. Otherwise, print the previous value. Whatever previous value is there, print it. That is the point we are configuring. So that, see what happens here. It says previous value was undefined and current value is John. That is why change detected. Na? It is tracking it. Previous value was what? Previous value was undefined and it is initialized with John. Then obviously change happened. It doesn't mean that only when you type, only when you select, change is happening. Right? Even you don't select, even you don't type anything, change will happen. That means a value is initialized, that is change detected. For example, now I am not initializing anything. Suppose I am not initializing. I am not initializing, then you can see it says previously undefined, currently empty. Then no change detected. No change detected. Now observe, I click here and start typing something. Now see what happens. So it says that change detected. Why? Because previously it was undefined and currently it is John. For every character actually, suppose you see now change detected. What was previous value? John. What is the current value? J. That means there is some change occurred. That means you remembered I told you NG model is called single source of truth. That means if anybody asked you how NG model is verifying the values changed or not, updating the changes, just by using a parenthesis, how it is managing everything. In the background, this is working. In the background, who is doing that? That is all managed by a phase called ng on changes. In the background, there is a method called, which method? On changes method, ng on changes method. In the background, there is an object called simple changes. This object have a properties like previous value, current value. They are identifying and they are updating. Then only NG model can know that I have to update. That means how NG model is working in the background. This is the architecture behind this. This is too much complicated for a fresher person to ask all this. Right? This much in depth, very less in interviews asked for freshers. But for experience, you have to know all this. If you show vast experience in technology, so then these all detailed questions are asked to you. Right? That means what is the role of simple changes object? What properties the simple changes object is having? Remember, simple changes object is not just having previous value, current value. It is also having, is it the first change or is it the second change? That means, is it first time changed or second time changed? So all such information is present in that simple changes. You see, go to output, yeah. Right click on simple changes, go to definition. When you go to definition, it will take you to simple changes. It is an interface. It is coming from where? Simple change. Right click on simple change and go to definition. Simple change is having previous value, current value, first change. In that we just used only previous value, current value. First change means, is it the first time changed or is it the second time changed? That is also identified, which is a Boolean type. Boolean means it will return true or false. That is in the background, how it is going to work. So technically, ng on changes is the first phase, is the first phase. And here, what are the activities performed? initializing of values, binding values to properties, binding values to attributes, by interpolations, class binding, style binding, event binding, and data binding. One-way binding, two-way binding, everything happens. That means if anybody asked you a question related to any of these binding techniques, it is related to ng-on changes. It is related to which technique? Change detection. It is related to change detection. This is the first phase. This is the first phase, phase one, right? And I will give a simple example here for this phase actually. So we have two options. One is output demo dot component dot ts. In output demo component dot ts, this is the logic. We have to implement for the class, we have to implement on changes. So now another one is output demo dot component dot html. In that we are presenting all the details. So that means we are collecting the value, tracking the changes, displaying the changes. Another one is input demo dot component dot ts. Input demo component ts is just having one property, and input demo component dot html. And here we are having this. This is the first phase related options. Other phases are very simple. Only this phase is complicated. Other phases are simple to handle and understand the concept. So the second one, the phase two. Phase two. So the first phase is about what is it? Managing the changes, right? ng-on changes. Second phase is, so the second phase is, so ng-on init. This phase is managed by ng-on init. This is managed by ng-on init. This is managed by ng-on init. So in the phases, we have the second phase, ng-on init. That is the second phase. What happens in this phase is actually, so this phase is managed on ng-on init. So what happens? It allocates memory for current component. It allocates memory for current component. ng-on init means it allocates the memory for current component. So which it is shared. It is shared to components. It is shared to components which are working within the context of current component. Within the context of current component. The phases, in this phase, memory is allocated for component. Actually, here important question is there, your component is a class. Your component is a class. And this component class is having a constructor. Constructor creates the object and allocates memory. If constructor is already allocating memory, why you need another on init to allocate memory? A class is already having a constructor which is allocating memory for this component. Then why you need another method to allocate a memory for this component? Because the memory allocated by constructor is only private to the class. That memory cannot be shared to the component which is running inside that component. That means, can we have a component in another component? Yes. Can we transport data from one component to another component? Yes. We can transport data, but that memory is not the memory allocated by constructor. We need some additional memory. That means if you want to store some data and we want to make the data available to another component which is running inside it, then the memory allocated by constructor cannot be shared. We have to do that by using another memory allocation that is done by ng on init. That means what this ng on init will do is, so it configures explicit memory for component, which is known as context memory, So if anybody asks what is difference between constructor and context. So the answer for this is constructor is private to the current component, whereas context is shared to another component that runs within the component. That means the memory allocated for the component is shared to the another component which is running. That means, for example, here 2 points are here now. Suppose here I will show you the concept is this one. Actually, this is the component. That means this is the parent component. So for this parent component, constructor allocates some memory. For the parent component, constructor is going to allocate some memory. In that memory, we can store some values. We can configure, initialize some data into that. In this, now there is a child component. Child component is running in this. Child component is running within this component. In this component, child component is running. Now, this data is not available to the child. That data is not available to the child. Then yesterday you saw that one value was transported from parent to child. Right? Value was transported from parent to child. From parent to child, we are transporting one data. How happened? If the memory of a component cannot be shared to another component, then how it will happen? How it can send it? That means now there is another memory allocated here for the component. This memory is called as which memory? Context. This memory is called as context memory. Now what happens? The parent value is sent to the context. From the context, it can be shared to child. For example, remember, context is available only to the component that is running within it. Suppose there is another component outside and this memory cannot be shared to that component. It cannot be shared to that component. It can be shared only to the component which is running inside the parent. Context memory means the memory allocated for a parent and accessible to its child. So constructor is allocating memory, but whatever you configure in the constructor of that particular class is not accessible to another. So this is done by using the which one, ng on init. Ng on init, that means what happens here? So child component so uses an input property, am I right? Child component uses input to accept data from the context memory of parent. That's what happening yesterday. That means in the parent context memory, some data was stored and that data is transported to child by using which one? Input. Allocating memory for a component, and making the memory available to the component which runs within the component. That memory is called as what memory? Context memory. Remember, these all concepts are present in other technologies also. Only the way of representation and the terminology will be little different, but this context memory terminology is same in every web technology in the world. Context memory means the memory allocated for one page and the memory shared to another page which is running within that page, right? Every web application have a context memory. Every web application deals with context memory. Now what is difference between the constructor memory and the context memory? Constructor is private to that particular component and context is shared to others. And if remember, you have to keep all these words in your brain, because they may ask in any way this question. They may ask like, so where input properties are processed, in which phase? In which phase input properties are processed? Ng on init. Understood? Because ng on init allocates context memory and input properties require context memory. They require context memory. That means where input properties are managed, they are managed in context memory. Context memory, right? And where context memory is allocated? In ng on init. Ng on init. That is the phase actually. So two phases, changes, another one ng on init. Ng on init. Initialization of memory is not the first phase, because already memory is initialized in the form of constructor. Constructor allocated the memory. Already when component is created, memory is initialized. That is the reason many times people have a doubt. Sir, initializing memory is first, na? After that changes will happen. No, this initialization is context memory initialization. It happens after ng on changes. After ng on changes, context memory initialization will happen. That context memory is shared to the other components which are running within that particular component. Because initialization of memory for component happens through constructor. That is done before the constructor uses on changes. Means before it uses ng on changes, memory is allocated. Why this is another memory allocated? To share the data to components which are running inside that particular component. That is what actually phase 2 is. Ng on changes, another one ng on init. Ng on init. That is what the phases are. Now, very important here, the data is transported. Now, what is the third one is phase 3. In phase 3, this phase is managed by ng do check. Ng do check. This is managed by ng do check. This is managed by ng do check. Now, what happens? This do check means, that is the next phase. Ng do check. Ng do check means, here in this phase what happens? Some actions means some interactions, some actions are not implicitly managed, are not implicitly managed. Some actions are not implicitly managed. So what we have to do is you have to create explicit actions. You have to create explicit actions. So we need to create some explicit actions. For example, already we discussed that transporting data from parent to child easily happens. You don't need any extra effort. We need to just pass the data. There must be some property in child component. That parent component doesn't need any extra effort to send the data to child. It can directly send the data to child. Only the point is child must have a property. Child must have a property. But when you are sending data from child to parent, then you need an extra effort. Right? That means now what happens is some actions cannot be managed internally. We have to explicitly manage. That means we have to create a custom event. Through that event, we need to transport the data. So we need to configure an event and we need to transport the data. That is done by using. So that means that is done by using event emitter. So event emitter is configured. Event emitter is configured. Event emitter is configured. Custom events. That means what? Custom events are triggered. In which phase? ng do check. That means internal events are managed in which phase? Internal events are managed in which phase? On changes. Explicit events are managed in ng do check. ng do check. ng do check means anything internally not managed by Angular, it is explicitly managed, configured. That is done by using whom? Custom events. That is actually done in which phase? Third phase. ng do check. Now tell me, so how the events are triggered? For that, two things are there. One, output is required. Am I right? Not only event emitter. So event emitter, right? Emitter, right? Event emitter. So output also required. Output properties are used to configure the custom events which can be triggered outside the particular component phase. That is what actually phase 3 happens. So if anyone asks where input activities are managed, in which phase? Input activities are managed in ng on init. And where output activities are managed? Output activities are managed in ng do check. Where inbuilt events are managed? ng on changes. Where custom events are managed? ng do check. ng do check. Okay, after all these, now that means memory is allocated, data is transported, everything happened. Now finally output should display. Output should display. Output means the presentation should happen. That is managed by this ng here content init. ng after content init. ng after content init. Content init is nothing but it is content initialization. ng after content init. So content init. So this is the another phase. This is managed. Phase 4 is managed by ng after content init. What happens in content init is the output is generated. The output is generated for all actions. Understood? For all actions, output is generated. Output is generated, and here output is generated means output is actually output is generated means better we say like this. Output is generated means the layout is generated. The layout is generated, but it is not ready. Layout is generated, the render process completed. Render process completed in this phase. You remembered I showed you browser cycle, na? You remembered I explained the browser cycle. Browser cycle means how translating happens, phases, right? What are the phases? We write markup. Markup is converted into bytes. Bytes are converted into characters. Characters are converted into tokens. Tokens are converted into elements. Elements means nodes. Nodes are arranged in a hierarchy called DOM. DOM is converted into layout. Layout is rendered. After rendered, their last process is called painting. The result of painting is output generation. The basic execution flow of browser I explained in the beginning, right? That means now what happens is whatever output is generated by all actions, they are formed into a layout. After the layout, render process will happen. That means the output is ready to be delivered to you on screen. This phase happens on which phase? Content init. That means the content is initialized for sending you as output. Content is initialized for sending as output. But very important is, so here, so this phase manages only content defined by implicit actions. Implicit means internal actions. That means now custom events are there. They are explicit actions that will be managed by phase 5. So this is managed by ng after content do check. That means this is ng after content checked. ng after content checked. What is content init? Means internal actions related output is ready. Now external actions output need to be get ready. That is done by after content checked. That means here what will happen? Explicit actions related. Explicit actions means what? Custom events. Custom events related layout is generated. So it is rendered. That means two options are there. Internal actions, explicit actions. Internal actions related output is ready. External actions related output need to be ready. That is managed by custom events. Remember, this will not fire up if there are no custom events. If there are no custom events, this will not fire up. Which one will fire up? Only ng after content init. After that, next phase. Now phase 6. In this phase is managed. This phase is managed by after view init. ng after view init. What happens is the implicit templates are rendered into UI. The implicit templates are rendered into UI. That means the painting process for implicit actions is completed. The painting means what? Preparing final output and presenting it. Preparing the final output and presenting it. That is called as painting. The painting process for implicit action is completed. That means the output is rendered. The output is ready in view. Output is ready in view. View means what? UI na? The output is ready in view. But here still pending is there. Remember, this phase is managed by whom? After view init. After view init means internal templates are generated. Internal templates means what? Internal templates means divs, spans and other things are internally generated. Are there any external templates also? Are there any external templates also in Angular? Yes, we learned external templates, ng template. We learned template reference. We learned content projection. Am I right? Content projection means what? We are creating a template explicitly. We are rendering that into the page. That means internal template generation will happen. External template generation will happen. Two phases will be there. Internal template generation will happen in which phase? Ng after view init. That means here the activities like these will be managed. Ng if, ng switch, we learned ng for, these all activities are managed. These all activities are managed. After that, phase 6, phase 7. Now this phase is managed. This phase is managed by ng after view checked. Ng after view checked. Here what happens is explicit templates are rendered and painted. Explicit templates means what? We have ng template. We learned mg template. And not only that, you remembered we generated template reference. Am I right? And this process of creating explicit templates and rendering, this process is called as what? Content projection. Content projection happens in which phase? Ng after view check. That means internal templates are generated and presented. That is done by 6th phase. Explicit templates are generated and presented. Then final output is ready. First implicit templates, after that explicit templates. The process of generating explicit templates and presenting is called as content projection, which already I explained by using ng if then blocks, how to handle them. So that means in which phase the content projection happens? In which phase the content projection happens? Ng after view checked. In which phase change detection happens? Ng on changes. In which phase the output activities are managed? Ng do check. Ng do check. This all you need to read once, two more times, then you will get an idea of everything. You will remember. And the final phase, after output is ready, then we have phase 8. In this phase, this phase is managed by ng on destroy. This is managed by ng on destroy. Now here some interesting points are there. What will happen here if anybody asks? Ng on destroy means what happens is it will unsubscribe. It will unsubscribe the methods. It will unsubscribe the methods. What is meant by unsubscribing the methods? It will unsubscribe the methods. Unsubscribing the methods means actually we have written public, insert click. It is an void method. Now on button click, we are using insert click. Am I right? You remembered I told you sender sends a message to subscriber. That means who is sender? Click. Who is subscriber? Insert click. Now what happens is it will disconnect these methods. That means whatever the events are binded, it will disconnect them. So no more events will work. That means all the events are disconnected. That means all the subscribed methods are unsubscribed. If all the methods are unsubscribed, that means events are disabled. Events are disabled. So memory is destroyed. Memory is destroyed. So that means values are erased. and what happens is component is cleaned up. So cleaned up, component is cleaned up. These all are the phases. So that is all the various phases happens. That means it's not simply deleting. That means a lot of internal activities will happen. That means whatever the methods are connected, those methods are disconnected. Whatever events are configured, they are disabled. So no more events will work. The memory allocated for those events will be erased. The values will be erased and the component is cleaned up. Now, generally, if anyone asks like when a component is destroyed, that process I already told you. When a component is destroyed, when any another component is requested, when any another component is requested, then it is destroyed. So now the question here is then how to transport data from one component to another, not parent to child, from complete one different component to another. It's not possible. For that, we need to implement some state management techniques. By using those state management techniques, we need to transport data from one component to another. So for that, we have to depend on external libraries. Like majority of all technology people, like React, Angular, Vue, all these people depend on a third party called Redux. They depend on Redux. JavaScript based all technologies, they use Redux as a state management library. But this is additional. We need to learn about this library. So what is advantage of this library? It maintains data so that it can be shared across components. So it is a predictable state container, Redux. Redux is very popular for all JavaScript applications. This is Redux, a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. Every technology uses it, not only Angular, React, Angular, everyone uses. There are other techniques. We have query strings, we have route parameters, we will learn, we will discuss about that. But this is the basic cycle. So what is the overview here? What happens on ng-on changes? ng-on changes, initialization, property binding, attribute binding, style binding, class binding, event binding. So all these activities are done on ng-on changes. So who manages ng changes? Simple changes object. How will I identify the changes? By using previous value and current value. After ng-on changes, what is it? ng-on init. That means it initializes memory which is shared to the components which are running within that context. Where context memory is allocated, ng-on init. ng-do-check. In ng-on init, input activities are managed. ng-do-check, custom events are managed. Custom events, that means event emitters, output properties are managed in do-check. Content init is nothing but it is rendering and it is generating the layout for internal actions. For external actions, content checked. After that, output is generated for internal templates. Internal templates, output is ready by Vue init. External templates are generated by using Vue checked. So content projection happens in which phase? Vue checked. Content projection happens in Vue checked. What is content projection? What is change detection? So content projection is creating the templates explicitly, rendering the templates into the UI. Change detection, identifying the changes, updating the changes, right? Destroy, it will unsubscribe the methods, it will clean up the memory, and it will close the components. This is all the lifecycle hook methods, right? So even you don't write these methods, these all methods are internally working. Now I showed you one method, ng on changes, by using simple changes object. Ng on init we used in last example so many times. What we have done when we are fetching data from API on initialization, we have loaded the methods so that they can fetch. In other examples also we will see them, how to handle them. It's not like one example on this event, another example. It's not possible. We need to use these events according to the various situations, right? That we will understand in later phase. Various examples will come. So these are not practically handled every time. We need to know that these are happening in the background. That means even you don't write ng on init, ng on init will be working. If you want some additional activities to perform, then you have to write these events. That means if anyone asks like, can we implement, can a component implement? You see here component is implementing ng on changes. Can we implement another also? Yes, because it is implementing interfaces. Na? You can implement multiple interfaces. That means you can implement on init. Understood? If you are implementing on init, you have to write ng on init. So we have to write ng on init. So we have to write here, already written. So it is not there. So we have to write another option, that is ng on init. That means all these phases you can do multiple implementations, because these are not classes, these are interfaces. That means a class can implement multiple contracts. Already we discussed that. A class cannot implement multiple classes, but it can implement multiple contracts, interfaces, right? So we can add all the functionalities and define here. This is all the component lifecycle hooks. This is a very big concept. I will upload a complete document related to this. You have to go through all the points. In that I will give you complete FAQs also related to what questions are asked in interviews of this particular topic. Because this is such a huge concept to handle, we have taken separate time for that, right? Once we know this, that means now we finish with the concept of components. Now there is another concept here now. Once you know what are the components, we have another important. We need to know about other concepts, like we need to know how do we deal with, how do we work with pipes, how do we work with services, right? Services, pipes, and other topic like routing, right? All these are the concepts now that we will see in the next session, right? So in the next session, we can start with pipes. These are simple things. Component is only the major concept in Angular, because these are the main building blocks of Angular. Others are simple to handle. Pipes, services, routing, the such concepts, how they work, that we will see. So tomorrow we will do that, right? In tomorrow's session, we can go with the concept of pipes. What are Angular pipes, how they are used, we will discuss about that. Okay, tomorrow we'll continue, right? Is it clear to everyone, right? Once go through this. If you are having any difficulty, one more time I will explain the overview of these life cycle events in the next session. Okay, so tomorrow we'll continue then, right? Yeah.